In the meantime, let's get more on these GDP figures, showing our economy shrank by 7% last year, but was bouncing back quite strongly in the last quarter of last year. In other words, our economy recovering more quickly than most people had expected. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko is a development economist at the University of Stellenbosch's Business School. Dr. Moleko, good afternoon to you. I mean, is it possible to know why the bounce back in our economy has been more bouncy than predicted?
Thank you so much for having me. Quarter-on-quarter growth is really coming from a low base, and I think that's very important to note, particularly for quarter 3 and quarter 4. That's number one. If you compare whether or not we've really bounced back, we should look at quarter 4 and quarter 3 in relation to quarter 1. And quite clearly, we have not bounced back sufficiently to actually go back to pre-COVID levels, i.e. 2020 quarter 1. So the reason for the improved growth that you're seeing is not really improved output or performance. It's really because we resumed economic activity in the last 2 quarters from the lockdown, which was hard in the second quarter, which meant that non-essential services primarily couldn't operate at all. So I think the numbers can mislead us somewhat. Both seasonally adjusted and annualized numbers are showing that positive increases simply because we resumed economic activity, not necessarily because we bounced back to quarter 1 2020 levels.
How important is the agriculture sector in these numbers? It had a bumpy year, not because necessarily of anything special, it just rained a lot.
Yes. So I think agriculture as a proportion to GDP is less than 7%. Some subsectors in terms of regional, Eastern Cape 1.9%, you find some of the concentration ranging, but it's under 10% as a value add or component to GDP. That speaks to the lackluster contribution of the primary sector, including mining as a subsector. It may bounce, particularly because it's a non-essential or what we call an inelastic good. So the elasticity in terms of movement when there is issues on household income levels or wage drops in terms of income, it's really that more is spent out of the household income on food and consumables. People have to eat. So they really are, they suffer less in terms of the effect. I think the export market rather will show different numbers where you'll see a contraction in the numbers in terms of export because of global commodity demand going down and also shipping activity lessening during the year. But I think on whole, you'll see agricultural activity could be far higher, particularly if you have sectors like Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, and KwaZulu-Natal, the rural areas, producing more of the goods that we eat and the foodstuffs. So I think there's a lot of potential there to grow further.
I mean, if you looked at just these numbers and you took what the Treasury proposals had said back in 2019, when they had said, look, we believe that the agriculture sector could be a key sector in terms of creating jobs because it really does require a lot of labor, you would think, well, maybe this is the moment for agriculture to actually get going and create those jobs. But already this year there's a fight in the agriculture sector about the new minimum wage for farm workers, and then the way you've explained it, not entirely a lot of demand from our export markets, it might actually seem to try and create jobs in the agriculture sector is going to be quite tough to do.
I don't think so, Stephen. I think that wage and the duality of the agricultural sector must be looked at. So when I talk about duality, we've got a highly capital-intensive commercial farming type of agribusiness, which is the bulk of South Africa's agriculture. We've also got your middle emerging market and small-scale potential growth areas where labor absorption can happen. So we've got to look at these dually. The South African growth trajectory has mainly been to focus on your multinationals, your big business, your agribusiness, and expanding the capital-intensive nature. So what you're finding is the agglomeration of the industry. More companies are being swallowed by the big ones. We've got fewer farmers producing most of the goods. We've got more oligopoly-type structures coming from agriculture. But if you have smaller businesses, smaller enterprises at a local, at a district level across the board where you prioritize type of small implements, enablers, whether it's labor, inputs, machinery, equipment, roads, infrastructure, enablers such as those, this would really help in terms of outcomes in agriculture across the board. And you look at the oligopoly structure in retail and making sure our people can produce and supply those goods to the retailers. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done as enablers on the regulatory side. I do accept the notion that the wage issue and the agreements around the wage issue need to be discussed, broadly speaking. Do they hinder growth in a sector? I think the research is showing us that it's not necessarily a double-edged sword. I think for stability in the sector, for dealing with some of the inequality and lack of redistribution in the sector, you've got to have regulatory arm, particularly in South Africa, where there's been massive abuse in this regard. But I think that we need to look at how then do we balance and make sure we subsidize some of the other input costs that farmers are looking at. For an example, the input costs of electricity, of water, and these you look at then state-owned enterprises helping, and we know that there are serious issues in this regard in the country. So it's a question of regulatory and looking at how you subsidize input costs so that you can have a balance, so to speak.
I mean, Dr. Moleko, in the end, this all boils down to the thing that's really the most important, which is getting income into homes, which is about jobs. 10 million people unemployed, 56% youth unemployment before the lockdown, much higher now, perhaps as many as 12 million people who would like to be working but aren't and can't. I mean, in a way, this all comes back to the same problem we've had for quite some time, structural reforms in our economy. I've got to say, still, I mean, after all of this discussion, I'm still not feeling it. Am I missing something? Is there a structural reform somewhere that's, I don't know. I mean, are we likely to see anything happen?
Can I simplify it and say, for me, structural reform says we must double secondary sector contribution to GDP. The question then is, how do we do this? Looking backwards. How do we shift our planning from an economic cycle? How do we look at financial markets and capital investment to these products in the secondary sector? When secondary sector is spoken about, we're talking about manufacturing, construction, utilities, and these are your labor absorptive sectors. They also increase your rate of growth quite fast, more so than your tertiary services, which we've had, the services sector-led growth in South Africa. So if we can focus and zoom in on industrialization as a necessary condition to growing, rather than as an outcome, maybe, from the type of growth path that we have had. So when we talk structural reform, let's talk about doubling our manufacturing value add to 40% as a proportion of GDP, and then looking at how do we strengthen and revise all our economic structures, funding, the entire value chain, to improve not just exports as a proportion, but our manufacturing value add. What new businesses need to be supported? How do we make sure that the local industries across South Africa are owned by locals and actually processed by locals? And so we double the manufacturing contribution to GDP. And I think that's when we can really talk about structural reforms instead of this microeconomic reforms that we're talking about that doesn't change poverty, unemployment, inequality. So that is what we really need to see happening in the structural reform space. You're right. It isn't really coming to the fore. We're not seeing industrialization. We're deindustrializing. So let's come back to the core issue. How do we industrialize? How do we have a phased approach to ensure labor-intensive sectors grow? And we use all our policy instruments. We use our capital markets, our banking, our financial sector, reforming it towards productive investment and investment in an industrialized growth pathway.
Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, thanks very much indeed. A development economist at the Business School at the University of Stellenbosch. Do appreciate the time. All right.